The tide went out. The children went in every morning. When the Thames tide went out, it left behind everything the river had collected since the last low water. Coal fragments fallen from barges, nails and copper fittings lost from ships, animal bones from the slaughterhouses upstream, rope scraps, pieces of iron, occasionally a coin. And before the tide came back in, the mudlarks were already out there. Children as young as 6, sometimes younger. Old women who had been doing this for 50 years. Adults who had no other way to earn anything that day. All of them barefoot in the mud, because shoes were either too expensive to risk ruining or simply not owned. All of them working in water that contained the raw sewage of a city of 2 million people, the industrial runoff of the docklands, and whatever the Thames chose to offer up from its bed on any given morning. This was a recognized occupation. It had a name. It had its own informal rules and territorial claims. It was documented by journalists, social reformers, and census takers. And it took place in full view of the ships loading and unloading the cargo that made London the wealthiest trading city on earth. This is the story of what it looked like from the mud. To understand why mudlarking existed as a recognized occupation, you have to understand what the Thames actually was in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was not the relatively clean, managed waterway it is today. It was the primary economic artery of the British Empire, the most heavily trafficked commercial river in the world, and simultaneously the main sewer of a city that discharged everything it produced directly into it. Human waste from 2 million people, slaughterhouse runoff, industrial effluent from tanneries, dye works, and processing facilities lining the banks, the waste products of every trade the city conducted. All of it went into the Thames. The river smelled so badly by the mid-19th century that Parliament had to temporarily relocate during what became known as the Great Stink of 1858, when the summer heat made the smell inside the Palace of Westminster intolerable. But the same river that Parliament could not sit beside in summer was the foreshore that mudlarks worked in daily, year-round. The trade goods moving through the Port of London created a constant supply of valuable debris. Ships lost cargo overboard during loading and unloading, coal barges shed fragments into the water continuously, copper fittings corroded or broke loose, ropes frayed and fell, iron fittings worked themselves loose. When the tide retreated twice daily, it left some fraction of this material exposed on the foreshore, mixed into the mud among everything else the river contained. The mudlarks had developed a knowledge of the foreshore that was genuinely expert. They knew which sections of mud were most productive after which kinds of tides. They knew where coal was most likely to accumulate, where copper fittings tended to collect, where bones came to rest. They knew the texture difference in mud that had been recently disturbed by a ship's anchor versus mud that had settled undisturbed for days. They knew how to move on the mud without sinking in the soft spots that could trap a foot and hold it while the tide came back in. This expertise was not incidental to the occupation. It was the entire skill set the job required, accumulated through years of daily practice in conditions that made mistakes potentially fatal. A child who started mudlarking at 6 had, by 10, more practical knowledge of the Thames foreshore than most of the dock officials who were paid to manage the trade above it. That knowledge was worth nothing on the formal labor market. On the mud, at low tide, it was the difference between a productive day and a dangerous one. Now here is what the work actually did to the body of the person doing it. Henry Mayhew, the Victorian journalist who documented London's street trades in extraordinary detail in the 1850s, described the mudlarks he observed as among the most physically deteriorated workers he encountered in the city. He described children with permanently discolored skin from constant exposure to the mud, feet covered in cuts and sores from the glass, metal fragments, and other sharp material hidden beneath the mud surface. Respiratory problems from the gases produced by the decomposing material the mud contained. The mud itself was not merely dirt. It was a mixture of river silt, human sewage, industrial waste, and the decomposed remains of everything the river had swallowed over the centuries. Working in it with bare skin, for hours at a time, daily, was a form of continuous low-level exposure to a remarkable range of contaminants. Cholera was endemic in the communities along the Thames before the connection between contaminated water and the disease was understood. The mudlarks, who worked directly in the water and its sediment, were among the most consistently exposed. No medical attention was available to them. No occupational health consideration existed for a trade the law barely recognized. When a mudlark became too ill to work, there was no sick pay, no relief system specifically for them, and no record made of their illness unless it resulted in death that came to official attention. Mayhew's accounts describe mudlarks who had worked the Thames since childhood and were in their 50s and 60s, still working the same foreshore, visibly worn by decades of exposure. They had nowhere else to go. The mud had been their economy for their entire lives. The alternative to working in it was not a better option. It was simply nothing. And the city that they served, by keeping themselves alive in this way, buying the coal fragments they gathered to resell cheaply, purchasing the scrap copper and iron that moved through their hands and back into the industrial economy, watched them from the embankments without any particular urgency about what it was watching. Mayhew wrote about them with genuine sympathy. The people he wrote for read his accounts with interest. The conditions he described remained unchanged for decades after he described them. But the most revealing part of this story isn't what the mud contained. It's what the city decided the mudlarks were, legally, officially, and on paper, because that decision tells you exactly what London thought their survival was worth protecting. Here is what the City of London's formal relationship with the mudlarks actually looked like. The mudlarks occupied a legal gray area that the city found convenient not to resolve. They were not licensed, they paid no fees to work the foreshore, they held no official recognition from the Port of London Authority or any other body that governed the river trade. But they were also not formally illegal. The law that governed the Thames foreshore treated the scavenging of material that had been lost or abandoned as something distinct from theft of goods still under ownership. A nail fallen from a barge and embedded in the mud was legally ambiguous, in a way that a nail still on the barge was not. The mudlarks operated in that ambiguity, and the city tolerated it, because removing them would have required effort, generated resistance, and served no obvious economic purpose. The coal merchants, whose fragments the mudlarks gathered, were not actively demanding that the children be cleared from the foreshore. The copper and iron that moved through the mudlarks' hands and back into the scrap trade provided a small, but real economic function. So, the city's formal position was, essentially, a deliberate non-position. It did not protect the mudlarks. It did not provide for them. It did not regulate their working conditions, investigate the health consequences of their occupation, or consider whether children should be performing this particular form of labor in this particular environment. It also did not actively stop them, because stopping them would have required acknowledging them, which would have implied a responsibility the city had no intention of accepting. This is the bureaucratic logic of strategic invisibility. If you do not formally classify something, you do not formally have to respond to it. The mudlarks were real. Their poverty was real. The work they did was real and served real economic functions. The city simply chose to look at none of this, with enough formal attention to trigger a formal obligation. And so they continued, season after season, tide after tide, picking through the mud that the city produced and released into the river twice a day, returning whatever small value they could extract from it, back into the economic system that had decided they did not officially exist within it. We don't have mudlarks in the Victorian sense anymore. The embankment construction of the 1860s, Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system, and the broader infrastructural transformation of London in the latter half of the 19th century changed the character of the Thames foreshore and the economic conditions that had produced the mudlarking trade. Child labor legislation, slowly strengthened through the 19th and early 20th centuries, eventually made the specific use of young children in this kind of work legally untenable. The formal mudlark is gone. But here is what replaced it. There are still people who search the Thames foreshore today for objects of value. They are called mudlarks by their own community. They require a permit from the Port of London Authority, and they are enthusiasts and hobbyists who have discovered that the river has not finished giving up what it collected across centuries. The foreshore still yields coins, medieval artifacts, clay pipes, pottery, and occasionally objects of genuine archaeological significance. The difference is complete. The Victorian mudlark searched the same mud out of necessity, so acute that the alternative was starvation. The modern mudlark searches it for pleasure, with a permit, with protective equipment if they choose, with the full backing of an authority that now actively supports the activity it once refused to formally acknowledge. What changed was not the river. What changed was who was standing in it and why. The Thames still holds what the city drops into it. The question of who picks it up and what that picking up costs them has always been answered by which part of the city those people came from and what the city decided it owed them in return. The mud has not changed. The city's answer to that question has. For some people, in some places, not everywhere, not yet. Here is what I want to know. If you found something genuinely valuable in a public space today, something that clearly belonged to no one, do you think you would keep it, report it, or something else entirely? Tell me honestly in the comments. This is just one tide. The city never officially watched go out. You already know where to find the rest.